In fact, the greatest impact would be on Rose Hill. That can come as no surprise because of the physical proximity of the two.
Well, the catchment plan that you went to originally, where you pointed out the differences between the east and west compared with mine, effectively shows that Mr. Hodgson's catchment area is east of mine and mine is west of his, effectively. There's a high degree of overlap, obviously, but at the margins, his is more to the east and mine's more to the west. And I think that's probably the reason why our sort of conclusions in relation to the relieving effect are different.
And then if we go forward to page 13,
yes,
you see the figures for 2021 and 2033 for the number of people who will for the first time be within a 30-minute cortege drive time of a crematoria, and that translates to, in both cases, even in 2033, less than 200 cremations.
Yes, if your proposed crematoria is essentially to relieve overtrading, it's unlikely you're going to have a significant benefit in terms of newly served cremations.
Can I take at one point in your rebuttal, if I may, please? Your rebuttal reproduces the Oxted appeal, doesn't it?
It does.
Which was bang up to date at the time you prepared this. Let me just get it. And at paragraph 4.6, you tell us that the Oxted case was based in part. I do apologise. Do you have it, Mr. Best?
I've got my proof. Yes, sorry, rebuttal. I was just trying to dig out the decision because it's not actually appended to my rebuttal. So I don't know whether I need the decision as well.
Well, it's in your proof of evidence, but I think I would like you to look at the decision letter. It's the wording of the inspector that I think is quite important.
Okay, if you just bear with me a second then.
Certainly.
What core document number is that, please? The
it's the appendix, madam, to Mr. Best's rebuttal evidence. He produces the Oxted decision as an appendix. As far as I'm aware, I don't think it is a core document as yet.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, if you've got it at 4.6, the Oxted case was based in part upon that scheme serving a significant area within which at present the population has to drive more than 30 minutes to reach a crematorium. It would appear to serve 67,901 such people, whilst I acknowledge this figure exceeds the 22611 people in the appeal site. I think that's your figure, isn't it? That 22611, 22,611 figure.
It may be.
Actually, no, it's Mr. Hodgson's figure.
I think it's Mr. Hodgson's, actually, yes.
Look at the
Yes,
footnote.
it is Mr. Hodgson's.
My apologies, Mr. Hodgson. Whilst I acknowledge this figure exceeds that figure around the appeal site, who would be within a 30-minute cortege drive time of a crematorium for the first time, nonetheless, the appeal scheme would benefit some such people. Can I ask you to go to the decision letter itself?
Yeah.
And let me just get it where the inspector's dealing with the section. Paragraph 42. I apologise for keeping you waiting. End of paragraph 42. In rebuttal evidence referenced in closing submission, the appellant cites the appeal site location serving an area currently not served within the 30-minute catchment area, with a total population of 190,000 for all. the sake of 40 people, which would be reduced by 122. Now,
Yeah.
on my reading of that sentence, it's not the 60-odd thousand that you're talking about, which is the difference between the two. That figure will be reduced so that the total number of the catchment population brought in to a 30-minute catchment would be 122,000. It's the use of the word by.
Yes, you may well be right on that. Yes, I think you're right.
Yeah. Okay.
I think the it doesn't affect the point though in paragraph 4.6 because clearly whether the figure is 67,000 or 122,000, it's significantly higher than we're talking about for the proposed development, and I'm not making a significant point on that. It was a point in passing that there will be some people, albeit a relatively modest proportion of people, who will benefit. Well,
part of the reason why I was asking you questions about this being a relevant consideration, certainly of some weight given by some inspectors, and part of the evidence that you gave at the Wheating appeal, was that is a markedly different. It's 6 times the amount of need, if that is a measure of need, in this particular case compared to the appeal sign.
But with respect, that was a completely different geographical situation. The need that arises in rural Norfolk is different from the need that arises in more urban South Yorkshire. And therefore, you have to look at what the prevailing circumstances are on the ground. And in Yorkshire, it's the fact that the existing crematoria are overtrading, not that there are massive gaps in the area between the Western Arc and Doncaster. In rural Norfolk, it's the gaps.
Can I ask you to turn back to Mr. Hodgson's evidence, please?
Yes.
His 512 and the table that follows that, and then the table that appears at the top of page 18. What Mr. Hodgson does, and as far as I can tell, he does this exclusively, he analyses the level of practical core capacity during a peak month with and without Brodsworth at the 2 dates that he looks to, which I don't think are materially different from your dates.
They're not materially different from my dates, no. Well, setting aside the issue about base year, he's 2033 and I'm 2034.
These would demonstrate the point that I made at the beginning of cross-examination, that for a development that is intended to, that has been, if I can use this expression, repurposed to address deficiencies in capacity concerning the Western Arc, we still don't see the relief that would result in the threshold of 80% being achieved in any case, do we?
Based upon Mr. Hodgson's figures, which I've just referred to the fact that his catchment area appears to be slightly east of mine and mine slightly west of his. He is showing an alteration in terms of a relieving effect. So if we look at Barnsley, 102% to 97%, so roughly 5% change. My figures show a higher diversion based upon my scenario 2, which is effectively the same approach as Mr. Hodgson, and then a higher figure again based on my rebalancing. But I wouldn't expect one crematorium to achieve the full meet the full need arising from the overtrading in the Western Arc. And I think Mr. Hodgson fairly acknowledges the fact that it might need 1 to 2 new crematoria.
Well, he doesn't. That part of his evidence I know has been referred to by Mr. Village previously, but that's a spatial point, not directly a need point. The spatial point that Mr. Hodgson is putting there, and it was what I intend to finish my cross-examination on, is that if you wanted to address need in the Western Arc, given the primacy of the location criteria affecting people's judgment as to how crematorium are accessed, the most obvious place is to put one in the Western Arc, or even 2 in the Western Arc, which Mr. Hodgson is making that point at 919. That's right, isn't it? You wouldn't put one to serve the Western Arc in the north of Doncaster.
Well, the application site, the appeal site, is west of Doncaster and east of the Western Arc. So it is in the middle, and it will draw cremations from both. I believe that it will draw significantly from the Western Arc on the basis of my modelling on convenience alone, 100% convenience, and also on my rebalancing, which is based on 70%, i.e. the overwhelming majority based upon convenience. Those are my figures. I believe them to be robust, and that's what I put before the inquiry.
Mr. Hodgson recognises that there would be some diversion, in each case less than 10%, and then some significantly less than 10%. I don't think in principle there's much between us. Let me put this point to you, and it's a spatial point, it's not a numbers point. We know that the nature of your client's application and its assessment of need had to change following subsequent applications by Horizon, and in particular my client's Memoria. And the case of need changed substantially, didn't it?
Well, it would have been ridiculous if the case hadn't changed, because the circumstances had changed. So when the application was put in, it was the only proposal. It was an application that was put to Doncaster Council for a site in Doncaster, and it focused on the relieving effect of Rose Hill within Doncaster. Having had the decision to approve Barnaby Dunn, which is accepted, we then looked at whether there was still a need, and in my opinion there is still a need, and that's based upon the Western Arc.
Let me ask you to apply your professional judgment, having done a number of these appeals. A more pronounced diversion, reducing the capacity pressures on the Western Arc, would be more likely to be achieved by locating a new crematorium in close proximity to the Western Arc crematoria that exist now.
If a notional site were to come forward to the west of the appeal site, then it would have at least as greater relieving effect as the proposed development, and in all likelihood slightly greater. But we're in a circumstance where over the last 60 years no other sites have come forward in that area alongside the Western Arc. We can point to sites academically and guess whether they would be better locations or not, but unless they actually come forward, unless somebody commits to them, then nothing happens. The appeal site will divert a substantial proportion of its cremations that it will handle from the Western Arc, that will produce relieving benefits to those existing crematoria and provide choice and competition for the local population.
Thank you very much, Mr. Best. That concludes my cross-examination. Thank you, ma'am. I'm sorry I went over my revised estimate.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. I mean, I've provided some flexibility there because it's helped to answer some of the questions I had. So that's fine. Okay. Are there any questions from interested parties here today for Mr. Best? Mrs. Job?
No, ma'am. Like
Okay,
stop,
thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Best, I did have some questions, some of which follow on from the cross-examination. You have to bear with me, I'm just going to go through them. The point was raised about the catchment population that was referenced in Mr. Hodgson's evidence of 122,000. And you there drew attention to the figure that you've referred to, 142,840, if that's correct.
Yes.
And my understanding is that Mr. Hodgson's 122 or roundabout figure is based on the 30-minute drive time. I appreciate that's not a point for you to necessarily clarify, but that was my understanding.
Well, my figure is certainly based on the natural catchment area. I had thought that Mr. Hodgson's was based upon his MDC, and I can't actually. Yes, it is. So on page 8 of his evidence, he says map 2.1 sets out the MDC for the appeal scheme. This equates to 120,670 people. So they're under the figures are both on a consistent basis, but they obviously relate to slightly different catchment areas.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank you for that clarification. Just diverting a little bit from that, paragraph 6.12 of your evidence, you refer to the fact that the viability of new crematoria is based on the requirement to repay the cost of capital investment in addition to normal running costs, and that older crematoria can operate on a lower turnover and don't need to be burdened with capital payments. It's paragraph 6.12 if you're there.
Yes.
Just to pick up on a point raised by Mr. Lathbury actually yesterday, obviously Dignity have taken over the running of Rotherham Crematorium, and it was pointed out that there's been significant investment in the chapel, refurbishing the chapel. So, Mr. Best, in terms of the existing crematoria, do you acknowledge that there would be the need for some investment in those facilities, and it's not just a case of business as usual? There would be some additional costs potentially to refurbishing in the future. It's not just day-to-day running costs.
At that crematorium, yes, I take your point and agree with it.
Would there not be a similar need in other older existing crematoria at some point to refurbish and make investment?
Well, that may be the case, but that really depends on whether the local authorities that own those existing crematoria decide to invest in it. Clearly, if they were to spend, plucking a figure out of the air, £1 million, then that does need to be repaid some way, and therefore, yes, you're correct that would be an additional. The repayments would be an additional cost, which would need to be accounted for in terms of the number of cremations it handles. I think that the cost, though, of a new crematorium is substantially higher than either Dignity invested at Rotherham. We don't know what anybody else would invest elsewhere, and therefore the capital costs are higher and are given for any new crematorium, whereas they're a possibility for an existing.
Okay, but there wouldn't necessarily not be any investment in existing.
That's fair. Yeah.
Okay. Just picking up on the point about the proportion of the population who would be brought for the first time within 30 minutes of their nearest crematorium, which to a degree you depict on figure 6.4 of your proof, and in that sort of white area shown there. Now, you said to Mr. Barrett you haven't calculated the actual figure. Now, I'd be amazed if you weren't aware of that figure. I didn't see it in your proof of evidence, but presumably there will be a figure on the basis of your evidence of the proportion of residents brought within that 30-minute kind of drive time area for the first time. So first of all, just to ask that question, are you aware of a figure on the basis of your calculations, and if so, can you present that?
I can't give you a figure as I sit here now. I know that we did look at it, and it wasn't particularly large. It was never really a fundamental element of the case. We noted the figure from Mr. Hodgson, and it didn't seem to take the point anywhere because we're not reliant on that. So I haven't got sort of tucked away at the back of my proof what the figure that figure is on our data. So I can't tell you, I'm afraid.
Okay. So in the absence of that figure, then I would need to rely on the figure in Mr. Hodgson's evidence, which doesn't seem to be significantly challenged.
I'm not challenging it.
Okay. Okay. I just want to be absolutely clear in terms of your chapter 10 and how you've undertaken the assessment of impact of your proposed scheme and the rebalancing exercise. Clearly in chapter 9, you assess the need aspect of it, and that's presented in table 9.14b. Is a table that I would take in terms of your assessment of need.
Yeah, could I just, sorry to interrupt you at that point, apologies for interruption, but mathematically from the other tables, 9.14a is the sort of the end position. 9.14b, I varied the figure for Rose Hill,
yeah,
on a, well, speculating that this gives them the opportunity to provide a longer slot length, and that is the implication of an hour-long slot. Obviously, I don't know that will happen. I hope it would happen. So it's table 14, 914A and 914B.
Okay, thank you. Can you just bear with me a moment? There's a bit of background noise. I'm just gonna deal with that a moment. Apologies, one of the problems of working from home. So that was useful. So in terms of the assessment of need, it would be table 9.14A that you would direct me to.
I think that is, in fairness, the end result of the assessment, with 914B being a variation of that.
Yeah.
That's a possibility.
Okay, so turning to the rebalancing, and the summaries provided during the cross-examination were useful in aiding my understanding on that. So you obviously look at the natural catchment areas and looking at the need arising from within those catchment areas. Now, can you just summarise very briefly for me the process you've undertaken in scenario 1, just so that I'm very clear?
Yeah, so scenario 1 is the existing situation. It's based upon the primary colours on the catchment plan 10 to A, and assumes that the dark area of the proposal isn't shown. And within the natural catchment areas of each of the crematoria, I've set out the number of deaths for 2019 in table 10.1, and I've converted that to cremations in the same table based upon the 80% ratio.
And but that would include Barnaby Dun being operational?
It assumes that Barnaby Dun is operational. Clearly it wasn't in 2019, but it assumes it was, because effectively it's based upon the natural catchment areas rather than what was actually trading at the time.
Okay, thank you.
Table 10.2 effectively sets out the equivalent proposition for 2034, and that's based upon the 85% cremation rate.
Ten point
10.2.
Yeah. Okay.
So the final column of both those tables, we know how many cremations are forecast for 2019 and for 2034. And then across the page, on page 62, I set out for 2034, and this is before the proposed development comes into play, the mean and peak month equivalents.
Okay, given the discussion in cross-examination there, obviously that those figures are presented as the sort of peak month of percentage affected capacity. Given the discussion about direct cremations, would the same 11% adjustment need to be made to table 10.4?
If you're running the figures based upon excluding direct cremations, yes, it would.
Okay, thank you. And scenario 2, based on purely convenience. Now, my understanding is that that would be based on assuming 100% within the sort of natural catchment area. Is that correct?
That's correct. And that applies for both the proposal and for the existing.
And that would be a similar exercise to that undertaken by Mr. Hodgson and Mr. Mitchell?
Yes.
So that would be the situation, you know, for me, comparing the different positions of the different parties. That would be the scenario that I would go to before you undertake further balancing, which goes beyond the balancing exercise undertaken by other parties.
Yes, that's correct. I think we should just recall Mr. Mitchell focuses on 2019, whereas both Mr. Hodgson and I project to a similar year.
Okay, so in terms of the position your position before that further rebalancing, just to be very clear, would that be set out in table 10.12a?
Yes.
Okay, now again, it's presented in terms of the peak month of percentage of factored capacity. Now, for my assessment, looking at the impact that the proposed development would make in terms of relieving pressure, it would obviously be useful to have a comparison between the existing situation, showing the existing level of trading, and the impact of proposed development, after that's operational. But obviously it's difficult to make that comparison because direct cremations aren't included in this table. So although the table presents the, in a sense, a percentage reduction, unless that 11% adjustment was applied, wouldn't be able to make a direct comparison. So presumably it would be a simple case of applying that 11% adjustment to table 10.12a.
Yeah, the 11% applies across the board to the number of cremations taking place.
Yeah. But in order to make a direct comparison between your existing tables and the impact proposed development, that 11% would need to be applied to that table.
And it would be applied in a consistent way so that the existing crematoria will be reduced by that number, the proposed crematoria by that percentage, and also the diversions as well. So ultimately, the proportions of diverted cremations are exactly the same.
Yes, Mr. Village.
Madam, I mean, I think, if I may say so, the most helpful thing from your point of view would be for Mr. Best to produce or to update his table to take account of the direct cremations. And I mean, clearly that's that would be a mathematical exercise, and we'd clearly share it with the other parties. But I would have thought that it's something that would assist you, and if I may suggest, it's something that perhaps we should ask Mr. Best to do.
I was actually coming on to that, Mr. Village. I'd much rather that those figures were reworked by Mr. Best rather than myself, just to be very clear on that position. So if the other parties don't have an objection to those figures being presented, that's what I would request. Any objections, Mr. Robson, Mr. Barrett?
Madam, I've no objection in principle because it's the matter I think principally raised by me. So if we, but obviously I haven't taken instructions on that. But if there is anything matter that I need to raise further, then I reserve my position. But it would, I'm sure Mr. Village would insist on this, be restricted only to the content of the amended table.
Yes, I think that's fine, Mr. Robson.
Yes, ma'am, as per Mr. Barrett, the same position. Of course, obviously there's dispute about the level of direct cremations, but that's a separate matter. Yes,
it's really to establish the updated position
Yes.
of the appellant. Okay, thank you. Just bear with me. It's interrupted my train of thought that for a moment. Just see if I've got any other questions. Mr. Best, you've obviously been questioned in terms of the further rebalancing in scenario 3, and the 20 to 30% figure upon which people make judgments based upon other considerations other than proximity. So I'm not going to go over that. What I did want to ask, in terms of the westerly research, just in terms of how statistically relevant that is, I understand it was based on a figure of 1,000 participants. Is that correct?
I don't actually know the answer to that. That would be a typical sample size in my experience. Often national polling is based on that sort of sample size, and for a shopping survey in relation to a retail impact study, 1,000 is a typical number. So that seems realistic, but I don't know that was the case here.
Okay, it's just obviously I'm being asked to rely upon that on that survey as evidence to support the approach for the rebalancing.
It isn't the survey that I've appended, it's the recorded results from the CMA. And they although they clearly took a different view from the operators, they accepted the validity of the survey, as far as I'm aware.
Okay, and was that survey undertaken at a national level?
I believe so.
And you also referred to the dignity research. Again, what statistical basis was that undertaken on?
My understanding of the dignity position is that was based upon their own in-house assessment, which would have been on a national basis, because they record the postcodes of the address of the deceased and the crematorium at which they are cremated, and based upon that and a GIS system, they're able to work out from their customer base the proportion of customers that use that the convenience metric and those that don't. So theirs is not based upon a survey and sample size, but is based upon their own data from their customer base, however large that might be, but I would expect it to be substantially larger than 1,000.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Mr. Best. That concludes my questions. Thank you for your contributions today.
Thank you.
Okay, if I could have the main parties back, please. Okay, well, we've obviously overrun today a little bit, so just to discuss an appropriate time to reconvene after lunch, I was going to suggest 2 o'clock. Would that be sufficient time without getting too much indigestion?
Madam, I would respectfully, if I'm entitled to decline that offer. Your timetable indicates that we finish at 4:25 today, and so unless there's a particular reason for that, I would have thought that we would be able to catch up at the end of the day. So we don't go much beyond 5 anyway, and be back on track. And I do have probably about half an hour of re-examination. I mean, I'll just check my notes. It may be that the agreement in relation to producing new tables can cut that down. But I mean, I have to say, given that I've got 2 hours down for the planning witnesses in total, right, I'm going to spread that between the two of them. It may well be that one of them gets 90% and the other gets 10%, or we'll see how we go. But I'm confident that we will finish all the evidence in any event by close of play tomorrow. So.
Well, that's certainly the position I would hope to be in, and I would ask for cooperation between the parties to achieve that. So on that understanding, Mr. Village, should we say to return at 2:20?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Shall adjourn the inquiry. Thank you.